about it. I don't think there is anything wrong with men having suicidal thoughts. But perhaps there is something wrong with our expectations of men in society that lead them to have those thoughts. Let's think about that. What does it mean to be masculine? What does it mean to be a man? Society tells us men should be strong, dependable, and able to provide for their family. There's very little research into the reasons why men suicide, but the recent research that does exist speaks about how men's high suicide rates are linked to risk factors such as history of being abused as a child, single status or relationship breakdown, and financial difficulty or unemployment. So that means that if you're a man and you've had a troubled childhood, you're still searching for the one, or you're worried about money, you're at risk of suicide. How many of us know men in that situation? I mean, I've definitely just described Richard, and I've probably described half of millennial men in the UK. Unsurprisingly, these risk factors are linked to those traditional notions of masculinity, of being strong, dependable, and able to provide for your family. It seems as though when men feel they can't meet those expectations, they make themselves wrong for that. The research backs this up too. Just last year, there was a paper confirming that there is a link between men feeling unable to fulfill the stereotypical characteristics of masculinity and suicidal thoughts. Now, I imagine a lot of us in this room don't agree with those stereotypes, but some of us probably do, or at least know someone who does. How many of us have been guilty of saying man up at some point in our lives? I know I have. The conversation is starting to change. There are great campaigns like BBC Three's Real Men Do Cry and Calm's Ludicrous that are trying to shift those perceptions of men and masculinity and encourage them to be more open and vulnerable. But is it just men who are perpetuating these outdated stereotypes of what it means to be a man and making themselves wrong for that? I don't think so. I'd like us to consider what our role is as women. Just last month, I was chatting to a female friend of mine who described the guy she was dating as a sponge and too sensitive because he opened up to her about some of the anxieties he was facing in the relationship and how that was making him feel vulnerable. I cannot begin to describe the look I see on some women's faces when I speak about how men I know have broken down in tears in front of me. It's somewhere between discomfort and disdain. Men are already making themselves wrong for not living up to these masculine ideals of being strong, dependable, and able to provide for their families. They're already shaming themselves for that. Are we compounding the problem by making men wrong and shaming them for demonstrating those open and vulnerable behaviors that we say we want them to show us? Are we making men wrong for breaking out of these rigid stereotypes and for just being fully human? To the women in the room, I'm not saying that male suicide is our responsibility. I absolutely acknowledge that men have a huge role to play in breaking down these stereotypes. But as a woman, I can only speak to my experience and how I do see our role. What I'm inviting all of us to do, regardless of our gender, is to reconsider the expectations that we have of men in society and reconsider how we view men who have the courage to show us their vulnerability. I'm inviting us to ask the men in our lives how they're really doing and if they're struggling with anything they haven't told us about. And can we think about how we respond to that? How we might choose to empathize with their pain? Can we hold space for men and listen to them without trying to fix things? Tell them that we love them and that it's okay for them to feel however they're feeling. I'd like to tell you about another guy I know. He's a really good friend of mine. I used to work with him, actually. His name's Billy. He's super smart. He's genuine, authentic, kind, generous. He's just the kind of guy you really want to spend time with. So imagine how I felt when Billy called me at 11:30 a.m. on a Friday morning 3 years ago to tell me that he spent the night in hospital because the night before he tried to take his own life. He was 24. You're probably thinking I felt shocked, panicked, uncomfortable. Actually, I felt honored. I felt honoured that Billy felt that he could talk to me about his suicide attempt and how he'd been feeling. I thought back to my uncle, and I knew that I had a chance to respond differently to Billy. I met him with compassion and understanding and a safe space to talk about how he was feeling, without judgment. I didn't make him wrong for feeling the way that he felt or for attempting to take his life. I didn't try to label him as suicidal or as someone who needed to get better. I simply gave him a space to talk about whatever he needed to. I saw what he told me as incredibly courageous and not something he should ever be ashamed of. I can't help but wonder if this can make a difference. When I reflect on how my response to Billy was entirely different to the response my uncle used to receive when he spoke about suicide, I can't help but wonder what would happen if we had different expectations of men in society, if we had a different reaction to men who have the courage to show us their vulnerability, and a different reaction to men who have suicidal thoughts. Would men feel differently about suicide? I don't have the answers, but I am inviting you to consider the questions. Because I don't believe there is anything wrong with men having suicidal thoughts. But perhaps there is something wrong with how we react to that and our expectations of men in society. So what would happen if we all had the courage to go home tonight and have conversations with the men in our lives about how they're feeling and what they're thinking, including their suicidal thoughts? Yeah, it's going to be uncomfortable. I get that. But we do it with sex. Every parent dreads having that conversation with their kids about how babies are made. But we know it's important to keep our kids safe. So we do it anyway, no matter how uncomfortable we feel. I wish I could have had a conversation with my uncle like the one I had with Billy. I wish I could have told him, there is nothing wrong with you. There is nothing wrong with how you're feeling or what you're thinking. It's okay. I'm here to listen to whatever you need to say or talk about. Because your feelings are important. You're important. And you don't have to do this alone. Thank you.